There is a lot of excitement right now about experiential therapies, approaches like IFS or Somatic Experiencing or AEDP or emotion-focused therapy. But where did all these new therapies come from and why now? The truth is, the experiential therapy movement is a somewhat complex and fascinating story. And in this video, I'd like to share it with you. So let's dive in. Today, I'd like to tell you the story of how the experiential therapy movement came to be and how it produced this wonderful new umbrella of experiential approaches. But before I do, I'll just quickly define what I even mean when I use the word experiential. For a type of therapy to earn the label experiential, it must approach the work in a way that is more bottom-up versus top-down. Let me say what I mean. In a top-down approach, the aim is to purposefully utilize the prefrontal cortex, the more thinking, soothing, executive functioning areas of the brain, in order to regulate the emotions or impulses launched by the more emotional centers of the brain. Top-down approaches are usually focused on symptom management. Conversely, bottom-up approaches are aimed at accessing the root cause of the symptom. The assumption is that whatever we see on the surface by way of a psychological struggle, whether it be anxiety or depression or negative self-talk, substance abuse, that it's probably the result of something else going on underneath. In a bottom-up approach, the therapist therefore works to discover what the core root issue might be. Now, this can't be done through intellectualizing or analyzing ourselves in a heady way. It requires some mindful inner exploration. That is why when we are doing more bottom-up processing, the client is asked to actually track their experience and their mind's internal process in real time, rather than just talking about themselves conceptually. That way we can begin to explore what kinds of unconscious beliefs or assumptions might be holding us back. As I like to tell my students, there are really two things that people generally need to become more deeply aware of, and that is one, what they suffered, and two, what they learned from that suffering. In the videos to follow, we will talk a lot more about how experiential therapies look and feel and what makes them unique. But in this video, I really want to focus on how these therapies, or really this new branch of therapies, evolved. Because its history is pretty different from the usual creation story when it comes to a new branch of therapy being invented. Now, because there are many non-therapists who watch my channel, I just want to quickly define what I mean when I say a therapeutic branch, or we could use the word therapy camp or umbrella, because understanding that is essential to the conversation to follow. So in our field, while we have literally hundreds of different respected types of therapy, we only have a handful of overarching umbrellas that these therapies tend to fit into. We have the psychodynamic camp, the CBT camp, the humanistic camp, positive psychology camp, not to mention systems thinking, feminist psychology, among others. But how do these camps come into being? Well, what usually happens is that some therapists will have some new insight about how the mind works or can be helped to work better. And from that insight, they develop some new way of working with clients. They write a book about it, start training people, and ta-da, we have a new model of therapy. However, when a model becomes incredibly popular, then what starts as one model will often branch into many different models, sort of spin-offs or evolutions from the original. For instance, after Freud started psychoanalysis, all these different branches emerged from there, like Jungian psychology, object relations theory, even just the more run-of-the-mill psychodynamic therapy, which is a version that is much less formal. And while all of these approaches have their differences, they still all fit under the overarching umbrella of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic thought. Or to give one more example, after CBT was created, there have been many other therapies that have emerged in what CBT people call waves. So now we are on the third wave of CBTs, like DBT, ACT, compassion-focused therapy. Again, while all of these third-wave CBTs create a pretty large umbrella, the therapies under it come back to a shared historical starting point. But while all of the different camps of therapy can be traced back to their own unique starting point, usually with some core figure or figures involved, what is perhaps more important to remember is that each therapy camp has its own core principle that all types of therapy under that umbrella share, like a shared framework for understanding the mind and therefore the healing journey. For instance, the humanistic lens is based on the idea that healing and growth are innate capacities that we all have, and that as long as we get our core needs met, We each have the capability of finding our own unique path up the mountain. That is very different from the CBT lens, which is all about helping people manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that's also a really valid idea. It's just its own path or way of reducing suffering. Okay, so introducing you to the idea that there are all these umbrellas might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but it's just a general lay of the land in terms of the field of psychology that's important to understand if these next points are going to make sense. So here we are. We've understood that most camps of therapy come back to some shared idea or framework, which entered into the field at a pretty clear historical moment with some small group of important people we give credit for, developing and introducing the core ideas of that framework. That is not how experiential therapy started at all. There was no one person or group we give credit for starting the movement. There are many people we can give partial credit to. There are some really important figures like Eugene Gendlin and Ron Kurtz, Habib Davinloo, Virginia Satir. However, there was no one person who had this core insight about the mind, based a therapy on it that they called experiential therapy, and then wrote a book and started training people, etc. I mean, the term experiential was used in a few new therapies, but not in a way that signified some kind of clear beginning such that then everything branched from there. But if experiential work didn't start from one place and then expand out from there, where did it come from? Well, it came from all of the other umbrellas. In other words, as these other umbrellas were evolving, a subgroup of therapists from many of them began to work in a way that we might today call experiential, still staying within their lens or framework, but using experiential techniques in order to deepen the work possible within that frame. Let me say that again. They were still staying within their lens or framework, but using experiential techniques in order to deepen the work possible within that frame. In other words, combining their own framework with bottom-up processing, whether through somatic tracking or mindfulness or imagery work, in order to use that framework in a more powerful way. But I know that's a bit abstract, so let me give some examples. To do so, let's take the 4 models I tend to cover the most on my channel because they're the 4 models I've been most trained in. Those are AEDP, Somatic Experiencing, IFS, and Coherence therapy. All 4 are experiential models for sure, and in that sense have a lot in common. But they aren't the same because they all came from completely different camps or umbrella frameworks. So what I'm going to do is take one model at a time, explain the camp it came out of and the core principle of that camp, and then show how that core principle can be explored experientially. Let's start with AEDP, which stands for Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. Dynamic as in psychodynamic. AEDP came out of the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic frame. That means you can trace its intellectual lineage back to Freud. The core psychodynamic idea is that who we are today and how we suffer today has been deeply impacted by our childhoods, particularly how we were treated by our parents, and how those experiences set us up to respond to other people in our lives and even shaped how we treat ourselves. That is a phenomenal core principle for a branch of therapy to be based on, especially when paired with understanding that most of those learnings around how to stay loved and safe are held unconsciously, which neuroscience has now validated as absolutely true. But alone, that insight is just an idea. And intellectual ideas in and of themselves don't really help us tap into the deeper mind or do actual healing work. And the first therapists, the psychoanalysts, seem to struggle, understandably, in terms of accessing the inner mind. That's because they had decided not to coach or guide the client too much, which meant they weren't offering much help. They weren't actively guiding the client in how to access their inner world. In other words, how to slow down, get in their bodies, move out of storytelling toward a more mindful inner awareness, etc. In other words, they didn't at first have experiential techniques. Until someone named Habib Davinloo came along and said, hey, let's more actively help our clients notice where they are turning away from their inner world and actively coach them how to choose to focus inwardly. Let's begin to ask about what is happening in the moment and in the body, etc. Through integrating experiential techniques, Davinloo created the first experiential psychodynamic psychotherapy called ISTDP, which AEDP sort of came out of. There are today about 7 experiential dynamic psychotherapies. I just happen to be trained in AEDP because I think it's very elegant, but there are others. and they are all rooted in the shift Dav and Lu made toward experiential technique. To summarize, experiential dynamic therapies like AEDP are all experiential, but represent the unique version of experiential work that came out of the psychodynamic frame, which, by the way, means it is particularly aimed at resolving attachment wounds. But does that mean that's where experiential therapy started and that all other experiential approaches are psychodynamic? Nope. In fact, the second major model I learned, called Somatic Experiencing, did not come out of psychodynamic thought at all. It emerged from the somatic psychology camp, the people studying the mind-body connection. From that camp also came sensory motor psychotherapy, which itself sort of emerged from the first somatic therapy called Hakomi. This whole group of more somatically oriented therapists has its own history and, of course, its own core principle or insight. In this case, the insight that our minds and bodies are incredibly intertwined, which becomes particularly relevant in the case of trauma. So while somatic experiencing is in many ways similar to AEDP, because they're both exploring and transforming the mind through experiential, bottom-up techniques, they are also in other ways quite different. Okay, so how does IFS, internal family systems, fit in? That is the third model I got training in. Does it come out of either of those camps I just mentioned? Nope. It comes out of the systems umbrella, specifically family systems work, which is a different camp. Ultimately, IFS did integrate a lot of somatic elements and dynamic elements, but Dick Schwartz, who invented it, was a family systems therapist. He just differed from his colleagues in that he found ways to use the systems lens to do deep inner exploration, hence the name internal family systems. Definitely an experiential model, as the word internal suggests, but coming from its own way of understanding the mind. IFS looks at the mind as a system, which is not a surprise given that it came out of the systems camp. All right, now to the fourth model I was trained in, coherence therapy. Coherence therapy actually came out of something called constructivism. Constructivism is a branch of philosophy that most people haven't heard of. More people have heard of existentialism and are aware that existential thought ended up birthing existential therapy. Well, the same thing happened with constructivism, where a whole therapy was created around a philosophical idea. In this case, the idea that reality isn't just something we passively and objectively observe, but rather something we construct through our experiences and the models of reality we create from those experiences. This branch of philosophy suggests that our mind actively, if unconsciously, creates models of reality that we then live in and that affect all aspects of how we experience and respond to life. Now, that is also a great core insight for a whole branch of psychology to be based on. Indeed, it happens to really align with all we've learned from studying the brain. In fact, many neuroscientists even today use the word constructivist to explain how the brain constructs its maps of reality. However, on its own, again, it's just an idea. And the first constructivist therapists, I believe, struggled to use that idea for full-on deep experiential exploration until Bruce Ecker and Laurel Hulley came along and found ways to work in a more experiential way so as to deepen the exploration. In this case, of people's unconscious mental models or schemas or implicit maps of reality, however you want to call it. Hence, coherence therapy being born, which is definitely bottom-up and experiential, but foundationally resting on a slightly different orienting principle, which has to do with the fact that we all have these constructed realities that we live within, and that if we want to live differently, we need to change our deep, embodied sense of what is real. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but here's the bottom line. Experiential therapy is a really broad umbrella that has a uniquely rich and organic history. Its story is not one that is often told, perhaps because it is so complex. But it's largely that complexity that draws me to the experiential movement. I love that it didn't just come from one person's mind, but that experiential ways of working sort of emerged in a somewhat parallel way across many different camps. For me, that also gives me more faith that there's something important about this new way of working, because when you see many different people sort of discover the same thing in a fairly independent way, to me that is a sign that it is probably real and important. But why did all these people discover the same thing at once? What allowed for that emergence? Well, that is a story I would like to tell you in the next video. So I hope you stay with me. Thank you so much for watching. If you are liking my content, I would so appreciate it if you're willing to like or subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much.